What if I told you the CIA, yup, that one, played a vital role in the Taliban's rise to power? Ha! You would think I'm crazy, right? Right?
Well, you're crazy.
First, we have to give some context to the Taliban. They emerged from a group called the Mujahideen. In Arabic, this literally translates to those who struggle, or those engaged in jihad. It originates from the root word jihad, which means struggle or effort. In the modern era, the term is often associated with Muslim combatants engaged in an armed resistance movement, or as they would consider it, a holy war. Now we need to paint a picture of Afghanistan pre-Taliban. During the early 20th century, Afghanistan was a traditional, mostly rural Islamic kingdom. It was independent during the colonial era and acted as a sort of barrier between the British and the Soviets. Although a single nation, Afghanistan was, and still is, a very ethnically diverse region, which was religiously conservative. The political climate of the region was tribal and regional, with very weak central authority outside of major cities like Kabul after World War II. Afghan leaders attempted to modernize the nation via foreign aid from both the US and the Soviet Union. King Zahir Shah ruled Afghanistan from 1933 to 1973 during a relatively stable period, but slow reforms caused frustration amongst the Afghan people. Then, in 1973, the king's cousin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, staged a coup and declared Afghanistan a republic. He pushed for social modernization but faced opposition from both Islamic purists and communists. Khan initially sided with the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, also known as the PDPA, a communist party. He needed their, and by extension, the Soviets' help in order to seize power and install himself as the president. Once he had gotten what he wanted, he began purging Communist Party members from government positions, later distancing himself from the Soviets in favor of Western and Arab nations instead. After a power struggle, the PDPA launched a military coup in April of 1978. Through this, they seized power, now known as the Saur Revolution. The PDPA introduced radical socialist reforms, including land redistribution, women's education and rights, and suppression of traditional and religious leaders. This clashed with Islamic traditions, which caused anger and unrest amongst the rural Afghan population. The communist regime became increasingly brutal, with executions and arrests becoming more and more frequent. This resulted in uprisings and resistance throughout the nation, especially in more rural areas. The local rebellions sparked nationwide Islamic resistance against communism. These groups came to call themselves the Mujahideen. Their goal? Defend Islam and Afghanistan from an atheist, foreign-imposed ideology. The Mujahideen leaders were comprised of religious scholars, tribal elders, and village commanders, not necessarily trained soldiers. The Mujahideen themselves were never one unified army. They were a loose alliance of groups divided by ethnicity, ideology, and region. Each faction controlled its own territory, fighters, and funding channels. When the fighting broke out, many refugees fled to Pakistan, predominantly around the Peshawar region. This became the Mujahideen's political and logistical hub. There were many factions, but some of those prominent ones include Jamiat-e-Islami, Hezb-e-Islami, Ittihad-e-Islami, Jabha-e-Nejat-e-Milli, and Mahaz-e-Milli-e-Islami. With the Mujahideen and PDPA at war with each other, the Soviets feared the collapse of communism in the region. They believed that if this were to happen, Afghanistan would switch sides and become a US ally, something they did not want in the midst of the Cold War. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Soviet leaders claimed they were invited by the Afghan government to help stabilize the country. It was officially justified as fraternal assistance to a socialist ally, but was really about keeping control of their sphere of influence. The Soviets sent around 80,000 troops initially, with the number eventually rising to 100,000 troops. The invasion marked the beginning of a 10-year-long war between the Soviet-backed government and the Mujahideen resistance. On December 27, 1979, the Soviets launched Operation Storm 333. This saw covert Soviet special forces enter the Taj Beg Palace in Kabul to assassinate the current president, Hafizullah Amin, using KGB special forces, Alpha Group and Zenith Group, alongside Soviet airborne troops The operation was a success and replaced President Amin with a man named Babrak Karmal, a Soviet-aligned communist. To many Afghan natives, this was viewed as a foreign invasion. To combat this, religious leaders and tribal elders declared jihad, a holy war against the infidel occupiers. The Soviets expected a quick victory, but Afghanistan's mountainous terrain and the Mujahideen's guerrilla tactics held them back. Ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and local support tactics gave the Mujahideen a fighting chance against the better-equipped Soviet tactics, included bombing villages and scorching the terrain. This only fueled more resistance from the Afghans. Fighting ensued for years, with the Soviets controlling major cities like Kabul and the Mujahideen controlling the countryside. The invasion was condemned worldwide, with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan funding the Mujahideen through covert operations. The United States saw the invasion as a Cold War escalation, fearing that the USSR wanted access to the Persian Gulf and Middle Eastern oil routes. Afghanistan had become a proxy battleground between the US and the Soviets, with President Jimmy Carter calling it the most serious threat to peace since World War II. The UN repeatedly demanded Soviet withdrawal, but Moscow continued to refuse. This damaged the USSR's public image and resulted in boycotts like the 1980 Moscow Olympics. This saw the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, launching Operation Cyclone. Their goal was to fund, arm, and train the Afghan Mujahideen. To do this without appearing to be directly involved, they channeled support secretly through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. This kept America's involvement plausibly deniable while giving Pakistan control over which Afghan factions received aid. During the conflict, Pakistan essentially became the middleman between the CIA and the Mujahideen. Pakistan's dictator, General Zia-ul-Haq, saw this as a way of strengthening Pakistan's influence in Afghanistan and promoting Islamist ideology aligned with his own regime. The ISI distributed money selectively, favoring groups that were religiously conservative and loyal to Pakistan. Early CIA funding started at around $20 to $30 million per year, but by the mid-80s, President Reagan had assumed office. This saw the funding grow to over $600 million annually. In addition to this, Saudi Arabia matched every US dollar, essentially doubling the amount of funding received. This helped provide guns, ammo, propaganda support, as well as training and tactics for the Mujahideen. On November 29, 1982, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 37/37, which demanded Soviet withdrawal and reaffirmed Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and non-aligned status. The resolution, however, was non-binding, since it came from the General Assembly, not the Security Council of the participants. 114 voted in favor of Soviet withdrawal, 18 against, and 11 abstentions. In 1986, the CIA provided the Mujahideen with FIM-92 Stinger missiles. This was a massive game-changer. The Soviets' Mi-24 Hind gunship dominated Afghan airspace and terrorized villages. The shoulder-fired missiles helped eliminate that advantage and marked a major turning point in the war. In addition to the US and Saudi aid, various other countries also contributed. Egypt and China helped supply weapons. British MI6 and Israeli Mossad offered intelligence and logistical support. Arab volunteers across the Muslim world poured into Afghanistan to help fight, including one, Osama bin Laden. The influx of funding, tactics, weapons, and manpower turned a group of poorly armed rebels into a formidable guerrilla force. The US aimed to make the Afghan war the Soviet Union's Vietnam. As the war waged on, Soviet casualties steadily increased, with tens of thousands of troops either wounded or killed. The financial burden also strained the already struggling Soviet economy, which resulted in a growing disdain for the war amongst Soviet civilians. In 1985, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev came into power and became the USSR's president. Gorbachev's focus turned to economic reform, political openness, and improving relations with the Western world. The conflict in Afghanistan was seen as a bleeding wound and brought about negotiations between the USSR, America, Pakistan, and the Soviet-backed Afghan government. The negotiations resulted in the Geneva Accords, which were signed in 1988. An important note is that these negotiations did not include the Mujahideen themselves, a choice that plays a massive role in the future. The Geneva Accords themselves contained 4 main agreements. The Soviets agreed to withdraw all troops within 9 months and respect Afghan sovereignty. The United States and Pakistan agreed to stop military support to Afghan fighters. Pakistan and Afghanistan agreed to not interfere with each other's internal affairs. The withdrawal would also be monitored by the United Nations. The accords, however, didn't address other issues, such as establishing a new Afghan government, disarming the Mujahideen combatants, and reconciliation between Afghan factions. The failure to address these topics resulted in later issues in Afghanistan. Although the accords gave the Soviets an exit from the war without appearing to outright lose and ended international action, the conflict still persisted internally and left the Afghan war unresolved. The last Soviet troops left on February 15, 1989, leaving the communist government and armed conflict in the hands of President Mohammad Najibullah. Although the Soviets no longer had a physical presence, they continued providing financial and military aid. This, coupled with the Mujahideen faction's failure to unite under one militia, allowed the communist regime to continue fighting. Fighting continued until 1991. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and with it, the aid being provided to the communist government. Without this support, Najibullah's communist government collapsed just 1 year after the fall of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan had now lost its last centralized authority. With this new power vacuum, Mujahideen factions turned against one another, each vying for power and control over Afghanistan. Warlords carved out territory and controlled it through force. Kabul became a battleground of shelling and rubble. Lawlessness spread like wildfire, with looting, kidnapping, and abuse of civilians becoming the new norm. Various states, like Pakistan and Iran, backed rival factions. Afghanistan had become a failed state. Civilians were exhausted after over a decade of civil war. Religious leaders often criticized warlords for corruption and brutality. The Afghan people prioritized stability over politics, and these conditions favored a movement that would bring about order. Enter Kandahar 1994. A group comprised of religious students and former Mujahideen fighters emerged. Their name? The Taliban, meaning the students. Founded and led by a man named Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban promised to put an end to warlords, disarmament, and enforce strict Islamic law. They received financial and military support from Pakistan, with ideological backing from the Saudis. They quickly gained territory with limited resistance. In 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul. Najibullah was captured and executed, and the Taliban declared the nation the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Most of the country's warlords were defeated or fled, and by 2001, the Taliban had taken control of 90% of the country. With the Taliban now in power, armed with weapons and training provided by various countries and organizations, had eliminated communism and established Islamic law. The nation, however, was not out of the clear yet, with another man and his actions setting the stage for yet another war to be waged in the graveyard of empires.